The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in late October, the kind of gray, bone-cold morning where the sky sits low and heavy like a ceiling about to drop. I was standing in the kitchen of the apartment I could barely afford, stirring instant coffee with a plastic spoon, watching my 7-year-old daughter Lily draw horses on the back of an unpaid electric bill. The coffee was too weak and the apartment smelled like old carpet and yesterday's rain coming through a window that wouldn't seal properly. I had $14.62 in my checking account. I remember the exact number because I had checked it twice that morning, hoping somehow it had changed. It hadn't. My name is Clara Marsh, and at 34 years old, I was a woman standing on the edge of everything falling apart. I had spent the last 2 years rebuilding my life after a divorce that didn't just end a marriage. It ended the version of me I had spent a decade carefully constructing. The woman who had trusted completely, given everything, believed in the idea that if you were good enough, loyal enough, patient enough, the universe would reward you for it. I was wrong. But the phone call that Tuesday morning wasn't about my ex-husband or the divorce or the apartment with the leaking window. It was about my father. My father, Daniel Marsh, had died 11 days earlier, quietly, in the same small house in Clover Ridge, Kentucky, where I had grown up. Heart failure, the doctors said. Peaceful, they said. He was 67 years old, and he died alone because his only daughter had been too broke, too broken, and too ashamed to visit more than twice in 3 years. That is the truth I carry. It's heavy. It doesn't get lighter. The phone call was from my Uncle Roy, my father's younger brother, a man I had seen maybe 6 times in my entire life, a man who smelled like motor oil and spoke in short declarative sentences the way some men do when they've decided words are mostly a waste of time. He told me there was a will. He told me there would be a reading. He told me my father had left instructions. And then he said something that should have made me suspicious immediately but didn't, because I was still too numb, too grief-hollowed to hear the edges in his voice. He said, "There's nothing much to leave, Clara. Just the property and that old barn he never let anyone in." You know how he was. Stubborn old man. Probably nothing in there but rusted equipment and old feed sacks. Just a locked barn. That's what he said. What he didn't say, what he couldn't have known I would eventually find, would change not just my life, but the lives of everyone who had ever underestimated my father. And everyone who had quietly, deliberately, tried to make sure I never found out the truth. Stay with me. Because what was inside that barn was something no one in Clover Ridge was prepared for. And neither was I. If you've ever been told you're overreacting, when you knew in your bones something was wrong, this story is for you. If you've ever stood at the bottom of something, a divorce, a loss, a financial collapse, a moment where you looked around and couldn't find a single solid thing to hold on to, then you already know this woman's story before it begins. Because some stories aren't about extraordinary people doing extraordinary things. They're about ordinary people who refuse, just barely, just stubbornly by the skin of their teeth, to give up. This channel exists for those people. To understand what my father's locked barn meant, you first have to understand what my father meant to me. And to understand that, you have to go back to Clover Ridge, a town of roughly 4,000 people set into the rolling hill country of eastern Kentucky, where the tobacco fields had mostly given way to small cattle operations and auto repair shops and a Dollar General that everyone in town treated like a community center. My father, Daniel Marsh, was not a rich man. He was not an important man by any definition that the modern world uses. He drove a 1994 Ford pickup with a cracked dashboard until the day he died. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation from September through April. He cut his own hair badly. He made his own wine from wild muscadine grapes he picked along the tree line behind the property every September, and he gave it away in old mason jars to his neighbors whether they wanted it or not. He owned 42 acres on the eastern edge of Clover Ridge, land that had been in our family for 3 generations, land that his own father had nearly lost during the farm crisis of the 1980s and that my father had spent the better part of his adult life quietly, stubbornly paying back down to clear ownership. He had a small cattle operation, never more than 30 head, and a vegetable garden the size of a tennis court, and a workshop in the back corner of the property where he repaired small engines for extra money, charging far less than any professional shop would because that was just how he was. He was not a man who talked about his feelings. He was a man who showed up. When I was 9 years old and broke my arm falling out of the oak tree by the fence line, he drove 40 minutes each way to the hospital 3 times a week for follow-up appointments, every single time, without complaint, eating vending machine sandwiches in the waiting room because he'd never learned to pack himself a proper lunch. When I was 16 and my first boyfriend told me in front of his friends that I was too plain to date seriously, my father didn't say anything grand or comforting. He came home that evening with a pint of butter pecan ice cream, sat across the kitchen table from me, and just stayed there eating ice cream in companionable silence until I stopped crying. That was Daniel Marsh. He communicated in presence, in showing up, in doing the thing that needed doing without requiring an audience for it. But there was one thing about my father that I never fully understood when I was growing up, one habit, one behavior, that everyone in town found mildly eccentric, and that I had long ago filed under the general category of dad being dad. The barn. The old barn on the western edge of the property was a structure my grandfather had originally built in the 1950s, post and beam construction, rough cedar planking, a rusted tin roof that sang in the rain in a way that was almost musical. By the time I was a child, it was no longer used for livestock. The cattle had their own newer shelter closer to the pasture. The old barn just sat there at the end of a rutted track through the back field, padlocked with a heavy iron lock that I never once saw opened. I asked my father about it maybe a dozen times over the years. His answers were always variations on the same theme. Storage. Nothing you need to worry about. Old stuff. Once, when I was about 14 and pushed harder than usual because teenagers push hard on everything, he said something that stayed with me without my ever quite understanding it. He looked at me with that quiet, steady look he had, the one that made you feel like he was considering more than just the surface of the question, and he said, "Some things aren't ready yet, Clara. You'll know when it's time." I thought he meant old farm equipment. Thought he meant junk. I thought about that sentence every single day for 6 months after I opened that barn door. But in the years between that conversation and my father's death, I had lived my own life loudly enough to stop thinking about it. I had gone to the University of Kentucky on a partial scholarship, studying accounting because it was practical and I was my father's daughter, always practical. I had graduated, gotten a decent job at a regional insurance firm in Lexington, and at 26 I had married a man named Marcus Webb. Marcus was charming in the particular way that some men are charming, like a performance that's always slightly too polished, always slightly too aware of its own effect. He came from a comfortable Lexington family, the kind that had a lake house and opinions about wine, and in the beginning that world felt exciting to me, the farm girl from Clover Ridge who had made it somewhere, who had become someone who belonged at dinner tables with linen napkins and actual stemware. I learned, slowly, then all at once, that belonging in that world was always conditional on being useful to it. Marcus didn't hit me. I want to be clear about that because people sometimes assume that's the only reason marriages end badly, and it minimizes the very real destruction that can happen without a single physical blow. What Marcus did was quieter and more thorough. He criticized my work, not loudly, but constantly, in small asides and gentle suggestions that always implied I wasn't quite good enough, wasn't quite smart enough, wasn't quite polished enough. He kept our finances in his name, always for logical practical reasons that I accepted because I trusted him. He cultivated my isolation from old friends by being subtly, quietly difficult whenever I made plans, until the friction became easier to avoid than the friendships. By year 5 of the marriage, I had a daughter I adored, a job I'd downsized for his convenience, no financial independence whatsoever, and a slowly solidifying understanding that I had walked into a very elegant trap. The divorce began when I discovered, not through drama, not through a confrontation, but through the mundane act of opening the wrong email on the shared laptop, that Marcus had a second phone, a second relationship, and had been maintaining both for approximately 14 months. What followed was 18 months of legal proceedings during which I discovered that almost all of our marital assets were structured in ways that made them nearly impossible for me to access. The house was mortgaged beyond its value. The investments were in trust accounts that predated our marriage. Even our joint savings account had a second signatory, his mother, that I had never known about. I was not legally savvy enough, fast enough, or financially resourced enough to fight it effectively with the lawyer I could afford. I came out of the divorce with Lily, with my car, with my personal belongings, and with $4,200, the remains of a small inheritance from my maternal grandmother that Marcus's lawyers had not been able to reach because it had been kept entirely separate. I used most of that to cover first, last, and security deposit on the apartment in Moorhead, where I found a part-time bookkeeping job paying $16.50 an hour, and tried to figure out what a life looked like now. That was 2 years before the phone call about my father. I drove down to Clover Ridge 2 days after that call, Lily strapped into the back seat with a tablet and her stuffed rabbit named Professor Carrots, the car making a high-pitched noise somewhere in the vicinity of the front left wheel that I was pretending not to hear because I couldn't afford to think about it. The drive from Moorhead to Clover Ridge takes about an hour and 40 minutes on Route 60. I drove it in 2 hours because I kept slowing down, kept finding reasons to stop, a gas station coffee I didn't need, a scenic overlook I'd passed 100 times and never once stopped for. I was not ready. There is a particular quality to the grief of losing a parent when the relationship was uncomplicated, when the person was simply, straightforwardly, someone who loved you without agenda, and I was not ready to walk back into that house and feel the absence of him in every room. But eventually you arrive. You always do. The house on Route 9 looked smaller than I remembered it, the way childhood places always do, though my father had kept it neat and functional right to the end. The porch boards replaced, the gutters clean, the small flower beds along the front walk still visible beneath the October frost, the last of the chrysanthemums holding their orange and yellow blooms against the cold with what seemed like personal determination. My Uncle Roy was already there when I arrived, sitting on the porch steps with a mug of coffee, wearing his permanent expression of mild impatience. His truck was parked in the drive alongside a car I didn't recognize. A newer model gray sedan that looked professionally cleaned in a way that felt out of place against my father's gravel drive. Inside was Roy's wife, Diane, who had never warmed to me for reasons I had never fully understood, and a man named Gerald Sutton, who introduced himself as the attorney handling my father's estate and who had the particular effect of a man who considered himself much busier and more important than any situation he currently found himself in. The will reading was brief and somewhat bewildering. My father had left the house and the bulk of the acreage, 38 of the 42 acres, to Roy, with a provision that it remain agricultural land for a minimum of 15 years. He had left his truck and his tools to a neighbor named Pete Calloway, who had worked with him on and off for years. He had left a small savings account, $3,800, to the Clover Ridge Community Food Pantry. And to me, he had left 4 acres on the western edge of the property. The 4 acres that contained the locked barn. I remember the quality of the silence in the room when Gerald Sutton read that part. Roy's jaw was doing something tight and controlled. Diane was looking at a point on the wall above my head. Gerald Sutton was already gathering his papers with the efficient movements of someone who planned to be somewhere else very shortly. I remember thinking, 4 acres of rough field and an old barn full of rusted equipment. My father, who had nothing, left me the one piece of the property that had nothing on it. It felt, in that moment, like a small sad joke, the kind of thing that would only seem meaningful to a grief-soaked mind looking for signals in ordinary things. "Can I have the key?" I asked. Roy reached into his shirt pocket and placed a small iron key on the table without looking at me. "Nothing much in there," he said. "I checked the outside. You'd probably want to just clear it out and sell the parcel. Property taxes alone will eat you up." He made a mistake saying that. Not the practical part, the taxes were real. But the tone, the certainty, the mild contempt dressed up as practical advice. It was the same tone Marcus had used for 8 years to make me feel like my instincts were unreliable, my perceptions melodramatic, my judgment fundamentally insufficient. I picked up the key and put it in my pocket. "I'll take a look myself," I said. That night I slept in my father's house, in my childhood bedroom, under the same quilt my grandmother had made from fabric scraps, with Lily curled against me smelling like apple shampoo, and the wind off the November hills working at the bedroom window, and the particular silence of a house that has recently lost its person. A silence that is different from ordinary quiet, denser, more aware of itself. And I did not sleep well, and I did not dream, and at 4:17 in the morning I was lying in the dark looking at the ceiling thinking about a sentence my father had said to me when I was 14. Some things aren't ready yet. You'll know when it's time. The next morning was the kind of cold that has ambition, 29 degrees at sunrise, the grass white and stiff, the breath coming out in long visible plumes, the kind of morning that makes every small task feel like an act of will. I left Lily inside with a bowl of cereal and the television and the key I had found to the internet router. My father, inexplicably, had decent satellite internet, and I pulled on my coat and my father's old canvas work jacket that was hanging by the back door, still smelling faintly of motor oil and the outside, and I walked down the rutted track through the back field toward the old barn. The track was maybe 300 yards from the house, bordered by overgrown wild rose canes that had gone red and thorny with the season, and the barn sat at the end of it like a patient thing, like something that had been waiting. The cedar planking had gone gray with age and weather, silvered and cracked in places, but the structure itself was solid. My grandfather had built for permanence, for the long years, the way people did when they expected to be somewhere their whole lives. The iron padlock was cold under my fingers. It was heavy, the real, old-fashioned kind, not the decorative type, but a serious working lock the size of my fist. The key turned hard, with resistance, the way locks do when they haven't been opened in a long time. Then it gave. The hasp swung open. I pulled the heavy door on its iron hinges. It moved slowly, stiffly, like something waking up, and the smell that came out of the barn was not what I expected. I had expected dust and rust and decay, the smell of abandonment, of things left to age beyond usefulness. And there was some of that in the outer edges of the scent, underneath. But the primary smell was something else entirely. The smell of careful, deliberate preservation. The smell of things that had been kept on purpose. It took my eyes a moment to adjust to the interior light, filtering gray and thin through the cracks in the siding and a small, dirty window high on the north wall. And then I saw it. All of it. And I stood in the doorway of my dead father's locked barn on a 29-degree November morning and I put my hand over my mouth. Not from grief. Not from shock exactly. From the slow, arriving understanding that my father, who had never, not once, explained himself, who had communicated in presence and in showing up, who had said some things aren't ready yet, had spent 30 years building something. Not for himself. For me. I didn't understand the full scope of it yet. I didn't know what I was looking at in any complete way. But I knew, standing there in the cold with my breath clouding the air and my heart doing something large and disorganized in my chest, that I was looking at something real. Something substantial. Something that Roy had not checked, because Roy had been so certain there was nothing to check. That certainty would cost him everything. The first thing I could make sense of was the shelving. The interior of the barn had been fitted, carefully, by hand, using the same methodical craftsmanship my father brought to everything, with deep wooden shelving units along all four walls. The shelves were made from rough-cut dimensional lumber, solid and level, with small ledge boards to prevent things from sliding, and every shelf was packed. Packed with boxes. Flat, archival-quality cardboard boxes, the kind that cost real money, each one labeled in my father's neat, cramped handwriting with a date and a number. They went back in date order, the oldest on the lowest shelves, the most recent at eye level. The oldest boxes I could see were dated 1987. The most recent were dated just 8 months ago. Along the center of the barn floor, covered in canvas drop cloths that I lifted with shaking hands, was furniture. Not junk furniture. Not broken farm surplus. Furniture that had been wrapped with careful padding, moving blankets and bubble wrap and foam sheeting, and stacked and stored with the kind of care you give to things that matter. I lifted one corner of the nearest drop cloth and saw carved wood, dark, dense, with a patina that was not artificial aging but actual time. I pulled the cloth back further and felt my knees do something strange. It was a chest. A blanket chest, roughly 3.5 feet long, with carved panels on the sides depicting, I had to lean in close to see it properly in the thin light, hunting scenes. Dogs and deer and riders. The carving was deep and skilled and old. Not antique store old. Museum quality old. The brass hardware on the hinges and hasp was dark with age but solid, the original fittings. I opened the chest. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, was a quilt. Not just any quilt, a Baltimore album quilt, the kind made in the mid-19th century by skilled needlewomen as showcases of every technique they commanded, each block its own small masterwork, the whole thing composed with the deliberate complexity of a cathedral window. The colors had softened with age to the particular tones that old natural dyes achieve, brick red and indigo and a clear, sharp gold, and the condition was extraordinary. I knew what Baltimore album quilts were because my mother had loved antiques and had taken me to estate sales and flea markets as a child, narrating history in the way she knew it, pointing out the good from the ordinary. I knew enough to know I was holding something that did not belong on a shelf in a canvas-covered chest in a locked barn in Clover Ridge, Kentucky. I needed to understand what else was here. I spent the next 4 hours in that barn in the cold, moving systematically from shelf to shelf, opening boxes, lifting drop cloths, trying to create an inventory in the small notebook I had found in my father's canvas jacket pocket. The notebook already had writing in it, in my father's hand, dense and careful, but I didn't stop to read it then. I needed to see everything first. I needed the full picture before I could let myself understand any of it. What I found in those 4 hours was this: 237 flat boxes containing what appeared to be vintage prints, maps, and documents, some in simple archival sleeves, some in glass-fronted frames, all stored flat and undisturbed. 3 large oil paintings wrapped in layers of protective materials with only their stretcher bars visible, each tagged with a handwritten label. 11 pieces of furniture in various styles that I could not date precisely but that ranged in apparent age from early 20th century back to, in several cases, something that looked much older. A locked metal cabinet, separate padlock, smaller key also on my father's ring, that contained, in fireproof accordion files, documentation. The documentation was what finally stopped me. Because the documentation, the receipts, the provenance records, the handwritten notes in my father's cramped script, the photographs, the correspondence, told a story that I would spend the next 3 weeks trying to fully comprehend. My father had been collecting for 37 years. Not casually, not randomly. With the patience and the deliberate, slow-building intention of a man who understood that what he was doing was a long game. A game measured not in years but in decades, played out in estate sales and farm auctions and barn clearances and the slow accumulation of knowledge about things that other people consistently undervalued because they didn't know what they were looking at. My father, Daniel Marsh, had known exactly what he was looking at. The notebook in his canvas jacket pocket that I had been carrying around all morning. I finally sat down on an overturned crate in the middle of that cold, extraordinary barn, and I opened it and I read it. He had written it as a letter, not addressed to anyone by name, just beginning, in his direct, economical way, at the point where something needed to be said. If you're reading this, you found the key. I always thought it would be you, Clara. Not because you're special, though you are, but because you never stopped asking about this place. That matters. The people who stop asking are the ones who stop looking. I never wanted that for you. I had to stop reading for a moment. I had to put the notebook down on my knee and look up at the roof of that barn and breathe carefully for a little while. He went on. He explained that it had started with his own father, my grandfather, a man I had never known who had died before I was born, who had a habit of buying up the contents of old farmhouses when families moved on, not from any sophisticated collecting instinct, but from a Depression-era inability to see anything of possible use left to decay. Among those accumulations had been a few pieces that my father, as a young man doing research he didn't quite know how to describe as research, had begun to understand were valuable. Not just monetary valuable. Historically important valuable. He had sold one piece, a tall case clock movement from the early 1800s, in 1989, to a dealer in Lexington, for $4,200. He had used the money to pay down a debt. And then he had started learning. Seriously, methodically, the way he did everything. He had driven to university libraries. He had corresponded with curators. He had attended auctions, not as a buyer at first, just watching, learning the language of value, learning what provenance meant, learning how to read the signals in wood and pigment and paper that told you what a thing really was. He had started acquiring again in 1991. Slowly, carefully, never more than he could afford to lose, because he never forgot that the farm came first, the land came first, the real foundational thing could not be gambled on enthusiasm. He had turned an inheritance of accumulated junk into something else entirely over the course of 3.5 decades. And he had never told anyone. Not because he was ashamed. Not because he thought it was particularly remarkable. But because he had decided, after watching the behavior of certain members of his family, he did not name names, but the inference was not difficult, that knowledge about this collection in the wrong hands, before the right time, would accomplish nothing except creating conflict and giving leverage to people who had not earned it. He had left it to me. Not because I was his only child, but because, and here his handwriting changed, pressed harder into the page, you know what it is to lose what you built. I've watched you fight. The barn is for the next chapter. Not the last one. I read that sentence approximately 8 times. Then I put the notebook in my inside jacket pocket, against my chest, and I went back to the house to find my daughter. I needed to hold her for a minute. I needed that before anything else. But reality does not pause for emotional processing, and what came next arrived quickly and hard. I had been in Clover Ridge for 2 days when Roy came to find me. He came in the morning as I was feeding Lily breakfast at my father's kitchen table. He knocked. Roy had always knocked, which I had considered a small politeness, though now I understood it differently, and when I opened the door he had a man with him I didn't recognize. The man was in his 40s, with the compressed professional manner of a real estate attorney, carrying a folder, wearing shoes that were wrong for gravel driveways. Roy told me he had been thinking about the property division and had some concerns about the survey. He said the 4 acres my father had designated as my portion might not separate cleanly from the rest of the parcel without some complications regarding easement access. He was bringing this to my attention, he said, because he didn't want there to be any problems. He thought maybe the cleanest solution would be for me to let the 4 acres revert to the larger parcel and accept a cash buyout instead. The offer he named was $18,000. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back with that same mild certainty, the certainty of a man who had appraised the situation and found it uncomplicated, who was doing me a favor by resolving it for me before I caused myself trouble. I thought about the barn. I thought about the 137 flat archival boxes. I thought about the Baltimore album quilt and the carved chest and the 3 oil paintings I had not yet been able to examine properly. I thought about the notebook in my father's jacket pocket, pressed against my chest. I'll need to take some time to consider it, I said. Property taxes come due in January, he said pleasantly. I know when property taxes come due, I said. I'll be in touch. He made a mistake staying so calm about it, because his calm told me he was certain, and his certainty told me he knew or suspected that there was more to this than old junk. Somebody had said something, or he had done some investigation of his own, or his father's brother's instinct had finally caught up with him. Whatever the reason, Roy wanted that land. He wanted it in a way that was working to look casual and failing at the edges. I closed the door. I called a woman named Harriet Bloom. Harriet Bloom had been my mother's closest friend before my mother died. A small, sharp, fiercely energetic woman in her late 60s who had spent 35 years as a general practice attorney in Lexington before retiring to a farmhouse outside of Versailles where she raised standard poodles and grew heirloom vegetables with competitive intensity. She was the kind of person who had seen every variety of human behavior and had retained, through all of it, a precise and unsentimental clarity about what people were actually doing versus what they said they were doing. I told her everything on the phone. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her most formidable skills. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Clara, she said, do not sign anything. Do not discuss the contents of that barn with anyone. And get me the notebook and the documentation files today. She drove to Clover Ridge the following morning, 3 hours, arriving before 9, and spent 4 hours in the barn while I kept Lily occupied in the house, feeling the hours as a physical pressure in my sternum, alternating between a hope so large it frightened me and the practiced pessimism of a woman who had learned to protect herself from disappointment. When Harriet came back to the house, She washed her hands at the kitchen sink with the deliberate thoroughness of someone who needed a moment before speaking. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and looked at me. "Your father was an extraordinary man," she said. "I know," I said. "I don't think you know yet exactly how extraordinary," she said. "We need professional appraisals. Multiple, from reputable houses, not local, national level. We need a conservator to look at the textiles. And we need an attorney handling the estate work, which I can do, but we also need to deal with the access question cleanly and quickly before Roy gets creative." "What do you think it's worth?" I asked. Harriet looked at me with that precise, unsentimental look. "I think," she said carefully, "that your father spent 37 years building a collection that he knew, in specific categories, better than almost anyone in this region. I think some of what's in that barn is regionally significant. And I think a few pieces may be considerably more than that." She paused. "But I don't know yet. And neither should you until we do this correctly." She was right to be cautious. But she was also right that we needed to move. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the strangest of my life, and that is saying something given the previous 2 years. I was still technically living in Moorhead, still paying rent on an apartment I could barely afford, driving back and forth to Clover Ridge on the weekends with Lily while juggling my part-time bookkeeping work and trying to keep the ordinary machinery of single motherhood running. School pickups, grocery store runs on a carefully counted budget, the front left wheel noise that had graduated from a whisper to a protest. I was running on approximately 5 hours of sleep and approximately $12 in discretionary spending a week. Lily had a field trip permission slip that cost $22, and I spent 3 days figuring out how to cover it without missing the electric bill. I want to be specific about that. I want you to understand the actual, practical texture of what this period felt like, because it matters for what came next. Roy called twice. His attorney sent one letter, and Harriet handled it in a way that was, she told me, designed to signal capacity without tipping our hand. We were not scrambling. We were deliberate. We had time. We did not feel like we had time, but we were performing confidence with the precision of professionals. The appraisers Harriet contacted were based in Louisville and in Cincinnati. The first to respond was a woman named Dr. Anila Rajan from a firm called Heritage Documentation Associates in Cincinnati, tall, meticulous, with the particular intensity of someone who genuinely loved what she was about to look at and was disciplined enough not to show it prematurely. She drove down with an assistant on a gray November weekend, and they spent 2 full days in the barn. On the second evening, Dr. Rajan asked to speak to me privately. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had had the will reading, where Roy had presented his offer, where Harriet had told me my father was extraordinary. There was a pattern to this kitchen, to the conversations it was hosting, and I was aware of it with the heightened, slightly unreal awareness of someone operating very close to the edge of what they can absorb. Dr. Rajan placed a yellow legal pad on the table. She had been making notes throughout the 2 days. I had not been allowed to see them, which was its own form of sustained anxiety, and now she turned the pad so I could see the top of the first page. There was a preliminary figure. A range, written as a low estimate and a high estimate with a note that said, "Pending further research and confirmation." I looked at the numbers. I read them twice, the way I had read my bank account balance earlier that year, hoping somehow they would resolve differently on the second reading. They did not change. The low figure was $410,000. The high figure was $880,000. With a notation at the bottom, in Dr. Rajan's careful handwriting, subject to verification of provenance on items 7, 12, and 23, potential for significant upward revision if attribution confirmed. I did not cry. I had expected, in some sentimental corner of myself, that this would be a crying moment. Instead, what I felt was something quieter and more fundamental. A settling. A long, slow exhale of something that had been held for years. I thought about $14.62. I thought about the $22 field trip permission slip. I thought about my father at 4:17 in the morning, in the silence of his kitchen, making careful entries in the documentation files, building something in the dark with the patient dedication of someone planting trees for shade they will never sit in. Some things aren't ready yet. You'll know when it's time. The 3 items Dr. Rajan had flagged for verification were the ones that extended the process by another 6 weeks. 6 weeks that were both hopeful and excruciating, 6 weeks during which Roy's attorney sent 2 more letters that Harriet deflected with increasing firmness, and during which I developed a stress-related eye twitch that I began to think of, with grim humor, as my body's opinion on the situation. Item 7 was one of the oil paintings. Under professional examination and with the protective wrapping removed, it revealed itself to be a landscape, rolling hills, late afternoon light, a farmstead in the middle ground, executed in a style that Dr. Rajan recognized immediately but would not confirm aloud until the testing was done. Testing, in this case, meant pigment analysis and canvas dating and, ultimately, a consultation with a specialist in 19th-century American regionalist painting from the Cincinnati Art Museum. Item 12 was the Baltimore album quilt. Its documentation, a hand-stitched name and date in the backing fabric, partially faded, legible under UV light, placed it in 1852 and connected it to a documented Maryland needlewoman whose work had sold at auction in New York 18 months earlier for considerably more than the initial estimate. Item 23 was a collection of hand-drawn survey maps in one of the archival boxes, maps of this region of Kentucky from the 1820s and 1830s, extraordinary in their detail and condition, the kind of primary historical documents that archivists and museum collections compete for. The landscape painting was confirmed. It was not by a major name, not something that would appear in an international auction record. But it was by a documented regional artist of the mid-19th century, authenticated, with a provenance trail my father had painstakingly assembled, and its appraised value alone was $127,000. When all 3 confirmations came in and the final appraisal report was assembled, the number on the bottom of the document was $743,000. $743,000. In a locked barn that Roy had called nothing much, in a padlocked door that no one had bothered to look behind because they were so certain of what wasn't there. I need you to understand what that number meant in the context of my actual life. It didn't mean I was suddenly wealthy in any Hollywood sense. It meant that I could stop calculating to the dollar whether I could afford my daughter's field trip. It meant I could fix the car. It meant I could breathe horizontally, meaning I could make decisions from a stable position rather than from the constant crouch of financial emergency. It meant my father, who had driven a cracked dashboard truck until he died, had built a future for me in the one place no one thought to look. It also meant, very specifically, that Roy's $18,000 offer for the 4-acre parcel had been made with knowledge, not detailed knowledge, perhaps, but suspicion that there was something worth more in that barn. And that opened a different kind of legal question. Roy's response to the news, which he received through official channels, through his own attorney, when the estate was formally settled, was not graceful. He appeared at the Clover Ridge property on a Thursday afternoon when I was there working with a local contractor on basic infrastructure questions for the 4 acres. He came in his truck, and he was alone, which told me his attorney had not advised this visit, because attorneys always advise against Thursday afternoon feelings. He stood in the cold on the rutted track and told me my father hadn't been right in his last years. He said the collection should be part of the whole estate, not a separate bequest. He said he was going to contest the will. I let him finish. Roy, I said, my father was documented as mentally competent by his physician in August of this year, 4 months before he died, as part of his estate planning process. He worked with an attorney to structure this bequest specifically and carefully. The will has been reviewed by 2 independent estate lawyers. I would encourage you, genuinely, to speak with your attorney before you spend money on a contest you will not win. He had something else to say. I let him say it. Then I said, he left you 38 acres. He left me 4. And a locked door. You told me there was nothing inside it. Roy looked at me for a long time. Something was happening behind his eyes that I recognized, the particular calculation of a man reassessing everything he thought he knew about a situation and finding the new numbers very different from the old ones. I didn't know, he said finally. I know you didn't, I said. And I meant it. I believed him, mostly. He had been so certain there was nothing there that he had never looked. That is its own particular form of blindness, and it cost him more than he knew how to calculate, and I found I didn't have the energy to be angry about it anymore. He didn't contest the will. It took 8 months to properly document, insure, and begin the careful process of working with reputable auction houses and institutional buyers on the collection. Harriet handled the legal architecture. Dr. Rajan's firm provided ongoing consultation. A conservator from Louisville named Marcus, I was briefly and darkly amused by this coincidence, treated several pieces that needed stabilization before sale. I did not sell everything. My father's notebook made very clear that he had not built this collection to be liquidated for maximum return. He had built it because he loved the objects, loved their history, loved the idea of things being recognized at their true value after long misunderstanding. He would have wanted certain pieces to go to institutions where they would be studied and properly cared for. The survey maps went to the Kentucky Historical Society for a negotiated price below market value, with a provision that they be accessible to researchers. The Baltimore album quilt went to a textile museum in Baltimore, which felt exactly right, somehow achingly right, with full documentation and my father's name in the provenance record. The landscape painting sold at a regional auction in Louisville for $134,000, and I stood at the back of the auction room and watched a couple from Lexington bid it up past the estimate with the focused, quiet intensity of people who understood what they were looking at, and I felt proud of my father in a way that made my whole chest ache. I used the first proceeds to pay off my remaining debts completely, the credit cards, the car repair. The front left wheel had progressed to a CV joint situation requiring $840 that I had been negotiating with in my head for months, 2 months of back utilities, and Lily's school account. I did this methodically, in order of interest rate, the way an accountant does things, and I felt the satisfaction of it in my bones. I rented out my apartment in Moorhead and moved back to Clover Ridge. Not into my father's house, Roy had that, but into a small rented house on the edge of town, close enough to the property that I could walk to the barn in the mornings, which I did, often, even as it slowly emptied. Lily started 3rd grade at Clover Ridge Elementary and was immediately adopted by a girl named Ruby who had a pony named Crackers and an opinion about everything, and watching Lily navigate a new school with the particular resilience of children who have been through disruption and come out flexible on the other side was its own form of healing. I want to tell you about a morning in March, about 4 months after everything had begun to resolve. I drove out to the barn, by then mostly empty, the shelves bare, the great drop clothes shapes gone, the space large and clean and resonant with what it had held. The morning light came through the gaps in the cedar planking and fell across the concrete floor in long, parallel bars of gold and gray. It smelled like winter ending, like cold earth beginning its very slow rotation back toward warmth. I stood in the empty barn and I thought about my father standing in this same space, 30 years before, with the first pieces of what would become the collection, deciding something. Deciding to build in secret. Deciding to be patient. Deciding that the value of something was not determined by whether the people around you understood it. Deciding that some things are planted, not thrown away. That what looks like nothing from the outside can be everything on the inside, if you built it right and you waited long enough and you trusted the person you built it for. I had been thrown away. Or I had felt like it, by a marriage that reduced me, by a legal system that didn't protect me, by a financial situation that made me invisible, by the particular exhaustion of rebuilding from nothing when you're also raising a child and pretending to be fine. But my father had never thrown me away. He had planted something for me instead. In soil so private, so patient, so completely unlike the version of security the world usually advertises, that I had walked right past it for years without knowing it was there. I stood in the empty barn with the March light coming in and I cried, finally, fully, the cry I had been postponing since October, not from grief exactly, though grief was in it. From the overwhelming, complicated recognition of having been loved more carefully and more quietly and more durably than I had known how to receive. My father had known I would need a second chapter. He had spent 37 years writing the opening page of it. Lily asked me once, a few months after we settled in Clover Ridge, why Grandpa had locked the barn. She asked in the matter-of-fact way children ask about complicated things, directly, without the layers of implication that adults bring to everything. I thought about the answer for a moment. He was keeping something safe, I said, until it was time. She considered this with the seriousness she brings to things that interest her. Safe from what? From people who didn't understand what it was, I said. She thought about this for another moment. Like how Professor Carrots looks raggedy, she said, but he's actually very important. Exactly like that, I said. She seemed satisfied. I am still learning to be. A year after I opened that barn door, I registered a small business, a consultancy focused on estate documentation and historical object identification for rural families in this region of Kentucky. Not an auction house. Not a dealership. A service for people who had accumulated things over generations and had no framework for understanding what those things might be. People like my grandfather, like families all across this part of the country where generations of accumulation sat in outbuildings and attics and were routinely cleared out and sold for nothing by heirs who didn't know the language. I partnered with Dr. Rajan's firm for the technical assessment work. I brought in a retired local librarian with 40 years of regional history knowledge as a consultant. I named the business after the thing I kept coming back to, my father's own words, compressed to their essential meaning. I named it Planted. Not thrown away. Not left behind. Not nothing. Planted. Because that is what my father did, in a locked barn on 42 acres of eastern Kentucky hill country, over 37 years of patient, invisible, deliberate work. He planted something in the ground of my future and trusted that the time would come when I would know how to tend it. Starting over isn't the end. My father understood that before I did. He built the proof of it while I was still learning to believe it. Some things aren't ready yet. You'll know when it's time. I don't know. If this story moved something in you, if you've been the person standing at a door you didn't know how to open, or the person who has been told that what you were holding was nothing, drop one word in the comments. Just one. The word that describes where you are right now or where you've been. I read them. Every single one. And if you know someone who is in the middle of their locked barn moment, the part before the door opens when everything still looks like nothing, share this with them. Not because it will fix anything, but because sometimes the most important thing anyone can offer is the proof that the door does eventually open. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. This channel exists because of people like you, people who believe that the most important stories aren't always the loudest ones. Neither was my father. And look what he built.